Amen. And so with that being said, today I'm going to do a one-day series entitled A Dark Day in America. And I want to preach from Matthew chapter number 5. These are Jesus' words to his followers. Verse number 13. Ye are the salt of the earth, but if the salt have lost his savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is thenceforth good for nothing but to be cast out and to be trodden under foot of men. Ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on an hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who art in heaven. I want to preach for a little while using the subject light in darkness. Light in darkness. You may be seated in the presence of the Lord. Clap your hands if you're ready to receive the word of our God. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm absolutely amazed that out of all of the people that God could use for the specific purpose of leading his New Testament early church, that God would choose and use somebody by the name of Peter. God uses him in Acts chapter number 2 in order to preach the gospel. And from his one message on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter number 2, the Bible declares that 3,000 souls, not counting the men or the women, were added to the church on that particular day. He's not qualified to preach in Acts chapter 2 because he's cussing people out in Matthew 26. He's not qualified to preach in Acts chapter number 2 because he denies Jesus 3 times before the cock crows 2 times in Matthew 26. He's not qualified to preach in Acts chapter number 2 because Peter has anger management issues, so much to the point that he cuts the ear off to the servant of the high priest who comes to take Jesus in John chapter number 18, starting with verse number 10. But in spite of all of his faults, in spite of all of his failures, in spite of all of his shortcomings, in spite of all of his flaws, God does not throw him away like everybody else does. But he says to Peter that failure is not final, and because failure is not final, when everybody else tries to throw him away, God picks him up, puts him in a recycling bin, and he uses him in spite of in Acts chapter number 2. The first thing that I want to say to all of us on today is that if God can use loudmouth cussing Peter, who has anger management issues, who has coward tendencies, so much to the point that he denies Jesus 3 times before the cock crows 2 times, if God can use Peter, then God can use absolutely anybody. And all of us in here, under the sound of my voice, ought to be absolutely excited because you think that because of your flaws, you are disqualified from being used by God. You think that because of your failures, you are disqualified from being used by God. You think that because of your setbacks, that you are disqualified from being used by God. But aren't you glad this morning that when everybody else deems you to be unfit to be used by God, that God can use whomever he wants to, whenever he wants to, and however he wants to? If God can use Peter, God can use absolutely anybody. What amazes me about Peter is not just his preaching in Acts chapter number 2, but what amazes me about Peter is his writing in the book of 1 Peter. He writes in 1 Peter chapter number 2, starting with verse number 9, you are a chosen generation. You are a royal priesthood. You are a holy nation. You are a peculiar people. You've been called to show forth the praises of him who has called you out of the darkness into the marvelous light. That really doesn't mean much to you until you come to the understanding that Peter is writing to Christians who are persecuted. He is writing to Christians who have been mistreated. He's writing to Christians who've experienced brutality, not from people in the streets, but he's writing to Christians who've experienced brutality from people of the law, and he writes them in this particular verse for the specific purpose of letting them know who they are in spite of what's going on around them and what's happening to them. He says, I know that you are being persecuted, but please don't forget who you are. I know that you are experiencing brutality, but please do not forget who you are. I know that the persecution you are experiencing is not from the people in the streets, but it happens to be from those who are supposed to uphold the law. But in spite of everything that is happening to you, do not forget who you are and whom God has called you to be on the inside. So he writes for the specific purpose of letting them know that I know you are being persecuted, but I don't want you to forget who you are. So let me remind you who you are. In spite of the persecution, you are chosen. In spite of the persecution, you are royal. In spite of the persecution, you are holy. In spite of the persecution, you are peculiar. Aren't you glad this morning that we should never allow what we go through to cause us to forget who God has called us to be? Aren't you glad this morning that we should never allow what's happening to us to cause us to forget who's inside of us? And ladies and gentlemen, I got a sneaky suspicion out of all of the stuff that's going wrong inside of our country, the only reason we still have a small piece of sanity and the only reason we are still sitting in our right mind is because you come to the understanding, in spite of what's happening to me, that God lives inside of me. And is there anybody in here under the sound of my voice who can attest to the reality that because God lives, I can face tomorrow? That because God lives, all fear is gone. That because God lives, that my life is worth the living. I cannot allow what's happening to me to cause me to forget who's inside of me. And because God's inside of me, if God be for me, then who in the world can be against me? Somebody shout, he lives inside of me. Somebody shouted into Eastlake, Brown Springs, Gate City, and even High Chaparral here. And somebody talked to me this morning and said, preacher, don't forget about High Chaparral. Somebody shout, he lives inside of me. Never allow what's happening to you to cause you to forget who you are. In spite of the brutality that's happening to us, in spite of the murders that are happening to us, regardless of your ethnic background, economical background, your race, your gender, your creed, or your color, when you accept Christ, you are chosen. That's your first shout this morning. You ought to shout that when nobody else chose you, God handpicked you to be on this team. Somebody shout, I'm chosen. I'm not just chosen, but I'm also royal. Somebody shout, I'm royal. Yeah, I'm a king's kid. I'm just not no any kind of body. And because I'm not no any kind of body, you can't talk to me any kind of way. I'm royal, but watch this. I am also holy. That means God set me apart. He didn't make me to be like everybody else. He didn't make me to walk like everybody else. He didn't make me to talk like everybody else. But I'm not just holy. I'm also peculiar. I stick out like a sore thumb. You ever tried to wonder why certain folk get away with certain things, but when you try to do the same thing, you don't never get away with the same thing? That's because God marked you and you stick out like a sore thumb. God says we are peculiar, and because I'm peculiar, I can never allow the ills of society to cause me to forget who I am. Ladies and gentlemen, it is quite interesting to note that when it is that you survey what has taken place over the past 5 days, you cannot help but come to the understanding that it is a dark day in America. It's a dark day in America due to the fact that just days ago, there was a 37-year-old African-American male by the name of Alton Sterling who was gunned down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, not from people in the streets, but from somebody who uphold the oath to protect and to serve, who had on a blue uniform. And because of this instance, you cannot deny it's a dark day in America. It's a dark day in America, not just because of Alton Sterling. It's a dark day in America because of what happened in the state of Minnesota when it is that Philando Castle was gunned down during a routine traffic stop for a busted tail light. What happens when you play by the rules and you still get gunned down all at the same time? And because of what happened to Philando Castillo, you cannot deny that it is a dark day in America. It's a dark day in America, not just because of Alton Sterling, not just because of Philando Castillo, but it's a dark day in America when you think that you can conquer hate with hate itself. And so therefore, as a consequence, just one day later, there was a young black man who used to be inside of the military who called himself going to a peaceful protest in Dallas, Texas. And would you not know that he showed up to the protest, but he didn't show up to the protest to display peace, which says that just because folk are in attendance with you does not mean that they are in agreement with you. Doesn't that translate to the church in 2016? It's a whole lot of us in attendance. But God is saying, I don't just need folk in attendance, I need some folk who are in agreement. But because he was not in agreement, he took out his Uzi, his AK-47, running with the AK-47 bucket heat of heaven. He took it out his pocket, and when he took it out his pocket, he started to shoot all of the white police officers in his sight. He shot up 11 officers, 5 of them died and did not survive. And because of what took place in Dallas, Texas, you cannot deny it is a dark day in America. It is not just a dark day in America because of what took place in Dallas, Texas, but ladies and gentlemen, just one day later, I woke up to the news on Friday morning that on Thursday, ladies and gentlemen, there was a man in Piedmont Park in Atlanta, Georgia, and they found this man not just dead, but they found this African-American man hanging from a tree. In other words, somebody did not shoot him dead, somebody lynched him dead. The authorities claim that it was a suicide, but I got questions about that. I got questions about it. We really don't know the answer, but the day before, there was a KKK rally in the same park. And the day after the KKK rally, there's an African-American man that is not just dead, but he's hanging from a tree. And because of this, you cannot deny that it is a dark day in America. The question has to be raised, why would a good God, somebody shout, good God, why would a good God allow darkness to take place in the lives of good people? I'm going to ask that question again. Why in the world would a good God, if God is so good like you say he is? I mean, every time I come to church and sing the phrase, God is good all the time, and all the time, God is good. Well, if he's so good, why would a good God allow darkness to happen to good people? But ladies and gentlemen, all throughout the Bible, a good God is allowing good people to experience darkness. Joseph was a good person in Genesis 37 who dreamed that he would be large and in charge, but up until the fulfillment of his dream, he experienced some darkness. Job was a good person, but in spite of his character, in Job chapter number 1 verse 1, in Job chapter number 1 verses 13 through 19, when he lost everything, a good God allowed a good person to experience some darkness. Maybe Joseph is not enough for you. Maybe Job is not enough for you, but there was a man named Jesus. You do know who Jesus is, don't you? There was a man named Jesus who hung, bled, and died on the cross. And the old Baptist preacher said he went about doing good, healing the sick, raising the dead, giving sight to the blind, unstopping deaf ears, turning water into wine. And in return for all of his goodness, when he hung on the cross, it was darkness at noonday. At 12 p.m. in the afternoon, there was a good God who allowed a good man to experience some darkness. I submit to all of us this morning that the reason a good God allows good people to experience darkness is because of our scripture. In Matthew chapter 5, verse number 13, verse 14, he says, we are the light of the world. Well, if I'm the light of the world, have you not considered that when God allows darkness, it's an opportunity for his children to shine brightest, because light can only shine in darkness. Somebody just missed that. I'm going to say that again. If I'm the light of the world, somebody shout, I'm a light. I didn't say shout, can I get a light? We don't do that at New Rising Star. I said somebody shout, I am a light. if I'm the light of the world and lights only shine in darkness, that says to all of us that when God allows darkness, it is always an opportunity for his children to shine the brightest. And ladies and gentlemen, it might be dark in America, but I want to speak to every blood-washed believer in here under the sound of my voice. Flick your light on. Shucks. Somebody just missed it. I'm going to say it again. It might be dark in America, but I want to speak to every blood-washed believer under the sound of my voice. Turn your light on. You saying, preacher, there's no use in me turning my light on because it's not going to light up much, but you don't have to light up everybody. You just need to light up your corner. And if you light up your corner, I'm going to light up my corner. Somebody else is going to light up their corner. Somebody else is going to light up their corner. Somebody's going to light up the middle. And can you imagine what kind of America we would have if every Christian turned their light on at the same time? It would cause the powers that be to have to wear sunglasses. Somebody shout, I'm the light of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, this same Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter number 2, starting with verse number 9, you're a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people. Notice what he says after that. You've been called to show forth the praises of him who called you out of the darkness into the marvelous light. Somebody shout, out of darkness into the light. Not just any kind of light. Let's say it one more again. Out of the darkness into the marvelous light. Ladies and gentlemen, the marvelous light is not us. We're just the light. But the marvelous light is Jesus himself. Have you not considered that Jesus the Christ, Son of the living God, says in John chapter number 8, verse 12, John chapter number 9, verse 5, he declares that I am the light of the world. And because he is the light of the world and he lives inside of us, the moment we confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in our heart that God raised Jesus from the dead, he comes to live and take up residence inside of our hearts. And because the light is living inside of our hearts, there's no way possible for me to have light in me and to still be walking in darkness. So he's called me out of the darkness into the marvelous light. And the thing that all of us need to understand is that God does not call us to be light for us to hide from the world. I'm going to say it again. God does not call us to be light for us to hide from the world. You are the light of the world because you have the marvelous light living on the inside of you. But the reason that many of us are not shining in the midst of darkness is because many of us are trying to blend in with the world instead of being a light to the world. You know that you're trying to blend in with the world when you counter hatred with hatred. You know that you're trying to blend in with the world when you cuss them out just because they cuss you out. You know that you're trying to blend in with the world when you fight them just because they want to fight you. But can anybody attest to the reality? As hard as it may be, God did not call me to be like the world, but he called me to stand out from the world, which says to all of us that God does not call me to be light for me to hide from the world. One reason that many of our lights are not shining is not because we don't have a light, but many of us are hiding our light. Why are we hiding our light? We're hiding the light because I'm afraid that if I shine my light, I speak up and speak out against the ills of society, somebody's going to persecute me. I'm afraid that if I shine my light, speak up and speak out against the ills of society, somebody's going to do something evil to me. But can I pause to tell somebody it costs to be a light? Yeah, God didn't just call us to be a light, but when you turn your light on, please don't get it twisted. It costs to be a light. There was a couple of people who proved that to us just on this week. Just on this week, after the tragedy that all of us have seen, the first person who proved that it costs to be a light was an officer in Cleveland, Ohio, by the name of Nakia Jones, who spoke out. She didn't just speak out against the ills of society. She spoke out against other police officers. It's easy to speak out when your group ain't the one causing the ruckus. But you got to have the courage to speak out, even if you got to speak against your own people. She spoke out on Facebook Live candidly about how it is that she felt, and we heard that she was suspended. Then we heard that she got fired, and then the mayor of that particular city did cleanup duty, and he said she's still on payroll, but she was threatened with her job because she decided to be a light and she chose to speak out. It was not just Nakia Jones who chose to speak out. It was also Carmelo Anthony, NBA legend and superstar, who chose to speak out. He said to all of the athletes, not just inside of the NBA, he says we make millions of dollars, not just from our contracts from playing basketball and sports, but we make millions of dollars from endorsements. But he says right is right and wrong is wrong, and we got to be willing to speak out even at the expense of losing our endorsement. I got to speak out at the expense of losing my endorsement because it costs to be a light. It's not just Nakia Jones. It's not just Carmelo Anthony, but Birmingham native by the name of Ricky Smiley came off of his radio show, off a vacation, turned it on Facebook Live, and started to be a light. He spoke up, and then he spoke out. He spoke up, and he spoke out. He says, you think that I'm getting paid just because I got a radio show. He says, some of my money comes from the radio, but another part of my money comes from the endorsements that I have. Every time I read a commercial for Lowe's on the radio, that's money inside of my pocket. But he says, even at the expense of losing my endorsements, I gotta speak out because right is right and wrong is wrong. Which says that all of us, God has called us to be a light, but I cannot be a light if I do not know that it costs to be a light. So the question has to be raised, ladies and gentlemen, how do I know when I'm ready to pay the cost that it takes for me to be a light? How do I know that I'm strong enough in order to be the light that God has called me to be? How do I know if I have enough juice inside of my tank because it costs to be a light? Can I pause to tell somebody, you know that you're ready to pay the cost to be a light when you make up inside of your mind, I'd rather speak up and have nothing than be silent and have everything. I'm going to say that again. You know that you are ready to bear the cost of being a light when you make up inside of your mind, I'd rather speak up and have nothing than be silent and have everything. Have you not considered New Rising Star in all of our community development efforts that we're embarking upon, getting ready to embark upon the school and so many other things? New Rising Star is not the only somebody who's funding our efforts, but there are philanthropists outside of this church who don't look like us who are funding our efforts because they believe in what it is that we do. But I want to say this morning, even at the expense of losing somebody's endorsement, right is right and wrong is wrong. What kills people are not the perpetrators. What kills people are the silent people who don't say anything about the perpetrators. God gave you a mouth to praise, but he also gave you a mouth to speak up. And the problem with the African American church, I see a whole lot of praise, but I don't see a whole lot of speaking up. But when you walk outside of the sanctuary, you got to learn how to speak up, even at the expense of losing something, because it costs to be a light. Somebody shout, it costs to be a light. Question has to be raised, ladies and gentlemen. How do we as Christians model light in the middle of darkness? The first thing I got to do to model light in the middle of darkness is realize that being a light requires me to preserve the standard that Jesus set. Everybody repeat after me. To be a light, it requires me to preserve the standard that Jesus set. Jesus says to all of us, Matthew chapter number 5, starting with verse number 14, he says, you are the light of the world, but I can't understand the context until I look at the pretext. In the pretext, he gives to us what we call the Beatitudes. That's nothing more than a $2 fancy word that means certain attitudes that should be inside of the Christian. He sets a standard for the Christian attitude. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit, those who have total dependence on God. That's a standard, he said. He said, blessed are those who mourn, those who hate what God hates. Because this makes God cry and ought to make me cry. That's a standard that he said. He said, blessed are the pure in heart. It's not about what you do. It's about why you do what you do. There's nothing wrong with marching, but it's a whole lot of people marching just to get on candy-coated camera. And God is not just looking at what we do. He's looking at why we are doing what we do. Blessed are the pure at heart. He says, blessed are the peacemakers. That's a standard that Jesus said. You ain't going to just pray for peace and get it. You got to make peace. Then he says, blessed are you when men persecute you and revile you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my name's sake. He says, don't throw a pity party. He says, don't curl up in a fetal position and stop coming out of the house. But he says, rejoice and be exceedingly glad in the middle of persecution, in the middle of police brutality, in the middle of police hatred. He says that's a standard that I set. And after he sets the standard, he says in Matthew 5, verse number 13, you are the salt of the earth. Salt is not just in addition to flavor, but have you not considered in the Bible days that salt was a preservative? So when he gives the beatitudes, certain attitudes that should be inside of the Christian, and then he says, you are the salt of the earth. What he's saying to all of us, when everybody else goes left, when everybody else goes haywire, I'm calling you to preserve the standard that I set. Somebody just missed it. I think I'll say it again. He says, when everybody else goes left, when everybody else goes haywire, when the world is going crazy, you don't have to act like the world. Don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And he says, I want you to preserve the standard that I set. Number one, being a light requires me to preserve the standard that Jesus set. Number two, being a light begins and ends with my attitude. Everybody shout, it starts with my attitude. Everybody shout, it ends with my attitude. How do I know that? Before he says, you are the salt of the earth, before he says, you are the light of the world, mind you, he gives to us the beatitudes, certain attitudes that should be inside of the Christian, which says to all of us, after giving the beatitudes, certain attitudes that should be inside of the Christian, it is then and only then that he says, you are the light of the world. I can only be the light when I got not just a good attitude, but a God attitude. I can only be the light when I have not just a good attitude, but a Jesus attitude. And I'm convinced, ladies and gentlemen, that many of us need to be praying for an attitude alignment. Many of us need to be praying for an attitude adjustment, because we've allowed the stuff going on around us and the things happening to us to change the attitude that Jesus set inside of us. And God didn't call us to be a thermometer. He called us to be a thermostat. You do understand there's a difference between a thermometer and a thermostat. A thermometer rises and falls with the temperature, but a thermostat sets the temperature. Which means that if nobody else have a good attitude, I ought to have a good attitude. Now, I empathize with all of us this morning. I understand why you got a bad attitude. You're tired of these senseless killings. I understand why you have a bad attitude after Trayvon Martin. I understand why you have a bad attitude after Mike Brown. I understand why you have a bad attitude after Tamar Rice. I understand why you have a bad attitude after Alton Sterling. I understand why you have a bad attitude after Philando Castle. I understand why you have a bad attitude after the 5 police who were slain. But I want to flip it and ask this question. When nothing like this is going on in our world, why is it that you have a bad attitude still? What about in the in-between times when ain't nothing popping off? What about in the in-between times when everybody in our country is happy-go-lucky? You mean to tell me you still got a bad attitude? I mean, some folks just wake up with a bad attitude. Some folk go to bed with a bad attitude. Some folk go throughout their day with a bad attitude. How in the world you got a job, other people wish they had your job. You might not like your job, but at least you got somewhere to go to in the morning, and God keeps providing for you, and you still got a bad attitude. How in the world the doctors diagnose you with something that nobody knows, and God healed your body, and after he healed your body, you still got a bad attitude? How in the world he brought your marriage back together and reconciled your family, and you still walk around with a bad attitude? How in the world can he bring your prodigal sons and daughters back home, and you mean to tell me you still got a bad attitude? I came to tell somebody God has been too good to me in spite of all of the darkness around me for me to have a bad attitude. So in spite of all of the darkness, I'm going to light up the darkness with a smile on my face. I'm going to put a pep inside of my step. I will bless the Lord, not sometimes. I'll bless him in all times. His praises shall continually be in my mouth. Somebody shout, my attitude. Being a light begins and ends with my attitude. Certain attitudes that should be inside of the Christian. I don't care what kind of car you drive, how nice your car is. If you hit enough bumps in the road, your car's going to get out of alignment. So what? You got a Lexus. You can still get out of alignment. So what? You got a Maserati. You can still get out of alignment. So what? You got a Cadillac. You can still get out of alignment. You hit enough bumps in the road, you can get out of alignment. You know your car's out of alignment when you take your hand off the steering wheel. Take it off the steering wheel, and it starts to veer to one way or another direction when you didn't tell it to go in that same direction. Your car is out of alignment. Many of us, I don't care how long you've been saved, today you're saying to God, Lord, this is too many bumps. You've hit so many bumps, and it's caused your attitude to get out of alignment. You've hit so many crises, and it's caused your attitude to get out of alignment, and because our attitude is out of alignment, we can't be a light to the world. But my prayer for the body of Christ at this particular moment in time is not for anything material. I'm praying, Lord, if you don't do nothing else, fix my attitude. Lord, if you don't do nothing else, align my attitude. Lord, if you don't do nothing else, change my heart. Lord, if you don't do anything else, change my mind. Lord, if you don't do nothing else, change my soul. Lord, if you don't do nothing else, change my spirit. Somebody shout, fix my attitude. The third thing that we learn in order to model light in the midst of darkness is being a light is more about being than doing. Jesus didn't say, you do the salt of the earth. He said, you are the salt of the earth. He didn't say, you do the light of the world. He said, you are the light of the world. But the reason many of us cannot be is because many of us have forgotten that we are human beings, and we've started to function like human doings. And you brought that mentality inside of your Christian walk, and you think that Christianity is about what you do. It's not about what you do, because you can't do anything good enough to make yourself a Christian. It's about what Christ has already done. This is the reason why many of us have good works, but our works don't last. Because it comes from somebody else pulling us based upon their convictions instead of something that is deep down inside of us and who it is that we are. If light is inside of you, nobody has to beg you to speak up. If light is inside of you, nobody has to beg you to do good. If light is inside of you, nobody has to beg you to do right. I do it not to be saved. I do it because I'm already saved. Says all of us being a light is more about being than doing. Last but not least, and I'm getting ready to raise up out of here. How do we model light in darkness? You got to understand that being a light requires me to bring God glory. Somebody shout, bring God glory. By doing good works that bring us out of the closet. I'm going to say it again. It requires me to bring God glory. Somebody shout, bring God glory. By doing good works that brings me out of the closet. We got too many R. Kelly Christians. We got too many Christians trapped in the closet. You don't want to come out the closet, shine your light in front of everybody, because you don't want the world to know who you are, because you're afraid of what it costs. You're afraid of being persecuted. God didn't call us to hide from the world. Notice what he says in Matthew 5, verse 14. He says, no man lights a candle and puts it under a bushel. He says, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid. How in the world do I have a light, but I'm trying to hide at the same time? How in the world do I have a light, but I'm putting my light under a bushel? Many of us can't shine in this hour of darkness because we're hiding. God is saying, in the midst of this crazy world, I got some saved people. And if change is going to take place, hate to bust your bubble, it's not up to President Barack Obama. Change is going to take place. It's not up to the Honorable Mayor William Bell. Change is going to take place. It's not up to the Birmingham City Council. Bless their heart. If change is going to take place, it's not up to the Birmingham City School System. But if change is going to take place, it starts with God's people. He did say in 2 Chronicles 7:14, if my people who are called by my name shall humble themselves. Talk to God and don't just talk to the people on Facebook. Pray. Seek my face. Turn. 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 You can do all that, but if you don't turn. We marching when black boys are killed by white police officers, but nobody's marching in the street when we killing each other. Turn. Turn from their wicked ways. It says, then will I hear from heaven, forgive their sins, and I'll heal the land. Everybody stand to your feet.